Vanderbilt, Astor, Hearst, Miller, Maxwell, Doheny, Haggin. 7 names attached to private American landholdings on a scale no citizen holds today. The Vanderbilt's Biltmore estate ran to roughly 125,000 acres. The XIT Ranch fenced 3 million acres of the Texas Panhandle. The Maxwell Land Grant, patented across northern New Mexico, covered roughly 1.7 million acres, so large the United States government argued in court that no single family should have been allowed to hold it. Hearst's California ranch reached 250,000 acres, and every one of them lost it. But not one of them lost it the same way. A widow sold a national forest to the federal government within a month of burying her husband. A cattle baron who boasted he could ride from Mexico to Oregon and sleep on his own land every night saw his empire scattered within a generation of his death. $100,000 traveled to a cabinet secretary in a small black bag. An emperor of newspapers watched his creditors take the keys from his hands and sell his treasures off the floor of a department store. These were 8 machines of ruin, and no 2 of them worked alike. Chapter 1. 8 Empires, 8 Deaths. The scale that built each of these fortunes is the same scale that eventually broke it. A house too large to sustain. A herd too vast for one weak hand to manage. A grant so immense the law itself could not ignore it. What follows is not one family's chronology, carried from birth to burial in a single line, the way a biography usually runs. It is 8 separate case files, each closed under its own verdict, laid down side by side, because no single mechanism explains how 8 different empires, built decades and sometimes states apart, all arrived at the same word: gone. Some ended in dissipation, too many heirs dividing a fortune that was only ever built to be held whole, and then taxed in ways its founder never lived to see. Some ended in a weak successor's hands, a founder's shrewdness undone within a generation by an heir who lacked it and lacked the humility to hire someone who had it. One was never meant to survive at all, built from its first acre to be sold off piece by piece to men across the ocean who wanted their bonds redeemed, not a ranch preserved. One ended the moment its owner converted land into cash and then destroyed the cash faster than he had made it through a bad bank and a worse railroad. One ended by choice, an heir who looked at what his family had assembled and walked away from it on purpose, taking no descendant with him into the decision. One ended in debt. Decades of borrowing against art and castles and newspapers, finally called due by men with no sentiment for unfinished dreams. One ended with $100,000 carried into a hotel room in a small black bag, and a courtroom verdict that satisfied almost no one. And one did not end in ruin at all. It simply stopped being independent, folded whole into a company with no memory of the family that built it and no reason to keep the name. 8 machines, no 2 alike, and no family safe from more than one of them at once, since debt and dilution and a weak heir have a habit of arriving in the same house together. What decides a dynasty's fate is rarely the size of the fortune it started with, and it is almost never the will of the founder, who in every one of these 8 cases believed he had built something permanent. It is which of these 8 machines finds the fortune first, and how long it takes to finish the work. You may already have a favorite among these 8 collapses, the one that reads as the real tragedy, a family broken more by circumstance than by its own hand. You may also have already decided which family had this coming, the fortune built on enough cruelty or carelessness toward the people who worked its land that its loss will feel less like tragedy than correction. Keep both verdicts in mind as the record unfolds. It supports each of them at different points, and it will not settle the argument for you. It opens where American land fortunes so often did, on a house. And this was no modest house, but one built to outdo every other private house in the country, on land bought by the last man in the family who would ever be called its richest, standing on ground that would, within a single generation, undo the very name it was built to glorify. Chapter 2. The House That Ate Its Owners. In 1889, a 26-year-old heir named George Washington Vanderbilt II began buying farmland outside Asheville, North Carolina, one parcel at a time, for a house that no private citizen in the United States had attempted before and has not attempted since. He was the Commodore's grandson, the youngest of the family's third generation, and by the time the buying stopped, the estate stood at roughly 125,000 acres, a private domain assembled with money the family's railroads and shipping lines had made a generation earlier. The house itself, Biltmore, opened in 1895 with 250 rooms, designed by the architect Richard Morris Hunt, its grounds shaped by Frederick Law Olmsted, the same landscape architect behind Central Park in New York. It remains, to this day, the largest privately owned house ever built in America, a record no fortune since has tried to break. It was also, from its first winter, a machine built for spending money rather than making it. Vanderbilt had inherited a fortune, not a business, and Biltmore sat under no railroad, no bank, no monopoly, nothing generating income to match the estate's own upkeep. He experimented with scientific forestry and dairy farming to offset the cost, hiring the young forester Gifford Pinchot, later the first chief of the United States Forest Service, to manage the estate's timberland on modern principles rather than simply cutting it for cash. The forestry program was genuine, and it mattered enough to American conservation history that Pinchot's work at Biltmore is still taught as a founding case study. It did not come close to paying the house's bills, and Vanderbilt spent the rest of his life subsidizing a domain that Olmsted himself had warned would never support itself as farmland. He died in March of 1914, and within about a month his widow, Edith Vanderbilt, had offered to sell roughly 86,000 acres of the estate's forest to the federal government. She had already lowered her asking price once before his death, from $7 an acre to $5, taking roughly $200,000 less than she had discussed the year before, simply to see the sale close. The government paid something in the neighborhood of $430,000 for land that had cost the family vastly more to assemble and hold across 2 decades. That purchase became the core of Pisgah National Forest. The record frames the sale as an act of conservation, honoring her late husband's pioneer work in forest stewardship. It was also, whatever the framing, a widow unloading the better part of a private domain within weeks of becoming responsible for it alone. A crueler irony sits underneath that sale. Before Edith ever sold the forest to Washington, her husband had already sold its trees to a lumber company. Under a 20-year contract with the Carr Lumber Company, the estate leased out its timber rights at $12 an acre, netting something close to $870,000, considerably more than the land would later bring at the government sale. The forest earned Biltmore more money as a timber lease than it ever earned as land sold outright. A house that could not support itself had, without quite meaning to, proven that the trees standing on its own ground were worth more standing than the acres beneath them were worth selling to Washington. The dissipation did not stop with one house or one widow. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had died in 1877, holding a fortune, biographers have put, at roughly $105 million, the largest private accumulation of wealth then known in the United States. Within 30 years, no Vanderbilt ranked among the richest people in the country at all. Rockefeller had passed them, So had Carnegie, Frick, and Ford, men who had built or held a single income-generating machine rather than dividing a fortune among an ever-widening branch of a family tree. By 1973, when 120 of the Commodore's descendants gathered for a reunion at Vanderbilt University, a school their own family's money had founded a century before, there was not a millionaire left among them. The mechanism was never one blow. It was the number of heirs the fortune had to feed. Each generation dividing an inheritance, the last generation had already divided once, until the shares grew too thin to build anything on. It was the income tax the 16th Amendment created in 1913, reaching for the first time into wealth that had never been taxed at its source, and the rising property taxes on estates too large to justify their own upkeep, the very trap Biltmore had already demonstrated. It was, finally, a depression that emptied whatever reserves had survived the first two forces. A creditor never foreclosed on a Vanderbilt property, and a court never seized a Vanderbilt asset outright, the way later chapters in this record will show happening to other families. The fortune simply thinned, year after year and heir after heir, the way water leaves an open container in a dry season. Biltmore itself survived. Descendants eventually converted the remaining acreage into a tourist attraction, and the house finally began paying its own way, a full century after Olmsted first warned that it never would. The $100 million the Commodore left behind did not survive the century he built it in. Too many heirs, none of them holding what their grandfather had made. That was how the Vanderbilts lost an empire. 2,000 miles west, another founder was about to build a landholding even larger with his own two hands and lose it by the opposite failure of blood. Where the Vanderbilt fortune had been divided among too many heirs, this one would pass to a single heir who could not carry it alone. One man was handed everything the founder had built, and he proved unequal to holding it. Chapter 3. The Cattle King Left No King. 2,000 miles west of Biltmore, a cattleman named Henry Miller made the boast that became his legend, that he could ride from Mexico to Oregon and sleep on his own land every night without ever crossing another man's fence line. Whether the ride was ever made exactly as told, no record has confirmed, only that Miller said it, and that by the end of the 19th century the claim had come close enough to true to matter. Miller and Lux, the cattle partnership he had built from nothing, held close to 1,300,000 acres outright across California, Nevada, and Oregon, by some accounts nearer 1,400,000, and controlled roughly 10 times that again through leases and water rights. It was an empire that answered to no bank and no railroad, and, for most of Miller's life, to no heir capable of running it after him. That control rested on water as much as on titles to land. In 1886, the California Supreme Court ruled 4-3 in the case of Lux versus Haggin, upholding Miller and Lux's claim to the waters of the Kern River against a rival's attempt to divert them upstream. A rancher named James Ben Ali Haggin, whose own empire would collapse by an entirely different machine, one this record returns to before it is finished. Miller and Lux won the case in court, then in 1888 negotiated a private water-sharing agreement with the very man they had just defeated. The ruling still shapes how California divides water between neighbors today, a legal legacy that has outlived the empire that produced it. Miller ran his ranches on a shrewdness that went beyond fences and water rights. Any drifter who came to a Miller and Lux camp asking for food was fed from the hand's own used plates, a standing charity the men called the dirty plate route, and one that did double duty as protection, since a fed man did not burn a haystack or steal a calf out of spite. In an economy where a hungry drifter turned away had every reason to come back after dark with a match in his pocket, The plate handed across the fire was as much insurance as it was charity. It was the kind of unwritten system a founder carries in his own judgment rather than writes into a company charter, and it did not outlast him. In 1915, a year before Miller's death, his son-in-law and eventual successor, J. Leroy Nickel, ended the practice. The trouble it had quietly prevented for decades began to return. Henry Miller died in October of 1916, leaving an estate appraised at close to $40 million and an empire with no capable heir of his own blood to receive it. Command passed instead to Nickel, a man who had married into the family rather than been raised inside its judgment, and whom one scholarly account of the family calls rather incompetent. He became the caretaker of a machine that had run for half a century on one man's daily eye for water, grass, and men, and now had to run without it. The decline that followed was not a single blow, but a slow one. In 1933, with cattle prices collapsing under the weight of the Depression, Nickel sold the breeding herd and the Double H brand, the mark Miller had stamped onto cattle for 50 years, to the rival Swift Company. Most of the remaining land and stock were sold off before the decade was finished, and the company that had once run cattle from Mexico to Oregon without leaving its own ground was formally dissolved in 1964. No creditor forced the sale, and no court ordered it. The empire was simply allowed to wind down. The machine that undid Miller and Lux was not the machine that undid the Vanderbilts. Biltmore had drowned under too many heirs, a fortune divided and divided again until no single share was large enough to hold a house together. Miller and Lux drowned in the opposite scarcity. A single heir by marriage, asked to replace 40 years of one man's instinct for water and grass with paperwork and a title he had not earned. Both empires were killed by inheritance, though it failed each of them in a different direction. Miller had guarded his empire against fire, theft, and drought for the better part of 50 years, but he had no defense against the one hazard no fence could stop, an heir by marriage who had never been trained to run anything so large. The rancher he had beaten in the courts over the waters of the Kern River would go on to build an empire of his own on land those same waters fed. Haggins' turn in this record has not yet come. Chapter 4. The Ranch Built to be Sold. In 1879, the government of Texas made a deal that looked on paper like an act of civic pride: 3 million acres of empty Panhandle grassland, handed over to a syndicate of investors in exchange for a new state capital in Austin. Nobody called it a ranch charter. It was a land contract wearing a cattle brand, and from the day the ink dried, the men who held it were already counting toward the day they would sell it off. The building itself, once finished, cost just over $3,744,000, of which the syndicate spent roughly $3,224,000 of its own money completing it. It opened on San Jacinto Day in the spring of 1888, a state capital raised on borrowed cattle country. The company that owned the range beneath it, the Capital Freehold Land and Investment Company, had been incorporated in London in 1884, chartered with $15 million in authorized capital it did not yet possess. British investors bought shares in it, among them the Earl of Aberdeen, and John F. Farwell went out and raised close to $5 million more in bonds from British buyers. Every dollar came with an expectation attached. The ranch was collateral, and someday it would be repaid in cash, not cattle. That plan is worth stating plainly, because the popular memory of the XIT gets it backward. This was never a working cattle empire that later fell on hard times. From the first, the Capital Syndicate had intended to run cattle only until the land could be utilized for agriculture. The herds were a placeholder. The ranch operated largely without profit through most of its working life, because profit was never the assignment. The assignment was to hold the ground, improve it enough to be worth buying, and wait for settlers with cash in hand. Holding 3 million acres took real infrastructure, and the ledger of it is a document unto itself. More than 6,000 miles of barbed wire went into the fencing. By the turn of the century, the ranch carried roughly 1,500 miles of actual fence line, cut into 94 separate pastures, watered by better than 300 windmills and 100 earthen dams. The old story that the brand XIT stood for 10 in Texas, 10 counties the ranch supposedly touched, has never been confirmed in any of the syndicate's own records. It survives the way most good legends survive, repeated until it sounds truer than the paperwork underneath it. By the 1890s, the arrangement that had built all that fence was coming apart. The British bondholders who had financed it had waited close to a decade for a return that cattle alone could never generate, and by the end of the decade they were clamoring for the redemption of their bonds. The Farwell estate spent years working through the debt, most of it redeemed by 1909, and the London Company itself was formally dissolved in 1915. But the selling had started long before the paperwork caught up with it. Parcel sales began in 1901, when the cattleman George Littlefield alone bought 235,858 acres at $2 an acre, a fraction of what the syndicate had once hoped the land might fetch. The last of the XYT cattle went to auction on the 1st of November, 1912. The fences kept coming down for half a century after that, acre by acre, sale by sale, until the final parcel of the largest fenced range in American history changed hands in 1963, 84 years after the deal that created it. No bank foreclosed on the X1T, no court seized it, no family scandal brought it down. It ended the way a lease ends, on schedule, because ending was the only purpose it had ever been built to serve. Not every dynasty in this record would go so quietly. In New Mexico, a rancher named Lucian Maxwell was about to sell a kingdom of his own for a fortune he could carry off in a single bag. The money that bought his freedom would turn out to be the very thing that ruined him. Chapter 5. He sold a kingdom and lost the price. He signed his name to the largest private land transfer New Mexico territory had ever recorded, and nothing in the record suggests he paused to ask what $600,000 was actually worth against a kingdom that size. On the 23rd of July, 1870, Lucian Maxwell put his signature to the sale of the grant that carried his own name, just over 1,714,000 acres, patented larger than the state of Delaware. By most accounts, he carried the payment out in a single bag. He was 51 years old. He had ruled that ground for 2 decades as something closer to a lord than a landowner, and within 5 years he would be dead, the money mostly gone, and no will behind him to say where the rest of it should go. At Cimarron, the seat of his grant, Maxwell kept a household on a scale no ordinary rancher in the territory could match. Any night of the week, 30 travelers could sit down at his table, drovers off the Santa Fe Trail, territorial officials, strangers who simply happened to be passing through, served off dishes cast in solid silver, and none of them paid a cent for the privilege. His generosity ran alongside a temper that answered to no court in New Mexico. When he caught a man stealing from him, he did not send for the sheriff. He locked a log chain, close to 40 pounds of iron, around the thief's neck and left him chained to a post in the cellar for 46 hours. "His power was just as if he owned the whole outfit," one of his own employees said of him, and for the better part of 20 years that was close to the literal truth. Between Cimarron and Santa Fe, almost nobody held title to anything Maxwell had not first allowed them to hold. That kind of power had a buyer. An English-financed syndicate agreed to Maxwell's price in 1870, and it did not take the new owners long to discover that holding the paper was nothing like holding the loyalty of the people living on the ground it described. The company went bankrupt within 4 years. Dutch investors bought up the wreckage, reorganized the holding under a new name, the Maxwell Land Grant Company, and chartered it in Holland in 1880. A New Mexico ranching empire now answering to shareholders an ocean away who had never once ridden across it. Maxwell himself never lived to see any of that unfold. He put $150,000 of his $600,000 into the First National Bank of Santa Fe, and sold the stock again within 7 months. He lost another $250,000 on the Texas Pacific Railroad, a line that went nowhere near as far as the money did. By July of 1875, he was dead at 56, having squandered most of the proceeds in barely a fifth of the years it took him to build the fortune, and the record shows no will. What survives him is not an inheritance so much as an accounting of how fast a sum that size could disappear once it left the ground that made it. The Dutch owners inherited a problem Maxwell had never fully solved. Thousands of settlers had spent a generation building homes, digging wells, and planting corn inside the boundaries of a grant surveyed at nearly 18 times the size that Mexican colonization law had ever meant to grant 2 men, roughly 97,000 acres, by the government's own reading of the old statute, against the more than 1,700,000 that the patent actually claimed. When the new company moved to evict them and collect back rent on land some families had worked since before Maxwell ever sold it, the territory answered with what came to be called the Colfax County War, a fight that ran from 1873 to 1888. One of its bloodiest early turns came in September of 1875, when the Reverend Franklin J. Tolby, a Methodist minister who had preached openly against the grant's owners, was shot dead on a mountain road. The killing pulled in the shadowy network of lawyers, judges, and land speculators New Mexicans called the Santa Fe Ring, and eventually the 9th United States Cavalry, sent in to hold a peace neither side particularly wanted. Across 15 years of ambush, arson, and courtroom warfare, historians count as many as 200 dead, all of it fought over a signature a dead man could no longer defend. The federal government tried, in the end, to do in court what the settlers could not do with rifles. It challenged the size of the grant itself, arguing the patent had been drawn nearly 18 times larger than the law allowed and should be struck down or cut back to size. The case climbed to the United States Supreme Court, and in 1887 the justices upheld the grant in full. Their ruling set a standard that outlived every party who had argued it. A government land patent, the court held, could not be voided except on evidence clear, unequivocal, and convincing, a bar high enough that almost no challenger after Maxwell's grant would ever manage to clear it again. The court had settled who owned the ground. It never touched the money, and the money had already been gone for 12 years by the time the justices ruled. What is left of Lucien Maxwell today is a county line, a scatter of small New Mexico towns still carrying his name or his family's, and a courtroom standard still cited whenever a land title is challenged anywhere in the American West. The kingdom of silver plate and log chain justice had outlasted him by only weeks. The fortune it was traded for had outlasted him by not much longer. And the instinct underneath both, the conviction that a man who ruled absolutely could spend just as absolutely, was not unique to a ranch in Colfax County. This record was only getting started with it. Chapter 6. The landlords who fled the country. He said it from what he already knew was a deathbed. An old man in a New York townhouse who had spent most of a lifetime buying Manhattan by the block and had run out of time to buy the rest of it. Could I begin life again, knowing what I now know, and had money to invest, I would buy every foot of land on the island of Manhattan. John Jacob Astor told whoever was in the room in 1848, reckoned at his death to be the richest man in the country, on a fortune commonly put near $20 million, a figure that rests on report rather than any ledger anyone has opened since. He was not a man expressing satisfaction. He was a man who had worked out, a few years too late to act on it, that land under Manhattan only ever moved one direction, and he wanted more of it than he had allowed himself to take. His descendants took the lesson and built a system out of it. The Astor method was the ground lease. The family kept the dirt and rented it out to a builder for a stretch of 20 years or so, letting that builder put up the tenement, the rooming house, or the storefront with his own money and his own risk. When the lease expired, the building reverted to the family along with the land underneath it, at no cost to the Astors beyond the paper the lease was written on. It was an elegant machine for a landlord, and a ruinous one for a city, because no one who will lose a building in 20 years has much reason to fix its roof, its plumbing, or its stairwell in year 19. The Astors were slumlords, there's no doubt about it, the broadcaster Anderson Cooper said in a later account of the family's rise and collapse, and the arrangement itself, not the sentiment behind it, is what earned the description. The empire that grew out of that machine reached a scale most of its tenants never saw the edges of. John Jacob Astor's fortune was reckoned near $20 million at his death in 1848. His great-grandson, William Waldorf Astor, inherited in 1890, reckoned then, as his ancestor had been decades before him, the richest man in America. Every lease on every Astor property in Manhattan ran on the same 20-year clock, generation after generation, without exception. William Waldorf carried a fortune reputed at $100 million across the Atlantic in 1891. His new estate, Hever Castle in England, cost him a purchase in 1903 that turned a fortune built on New York tenements into an English county seat. William Waldorf Astor did not merely leave the country, he renounced it. On inheriting the senior branch of the fortune, he declared that the United States was, in his own words, no longer a fit place for a gentleman to live, sold what he could, and sailed for England in 1891 with the reputed $100 million behind him. He bought Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, in 1903, and rebuilt it as a private fortress fit for a man who had decided New York no longer deserved him. The British Crown gave him what New York never had. He was made Baron Astor in 1916 and Viscount Astor in 1917, a New York land fortune formally converted into an English peerage within one generation, the family's very name now carried by a seat in the House of Lords rather than a block of Manhattan tenements. The branch that stayed behind did not fare any better. John Jacob Astor IV went down with the Titanic in April of 1912, leaving an estate of $86,966,611 to his son Vincent, the last Astor to hold the family's New York real estate in any serious quantity. Vincent did not build on what he inherited. He spent much of his life quietly selling off the family's old slum housing, the very tenements the ground lease system had produced, and when he died in 1959, he left no children behind him to inherit what remained. His fortune went to the Vincent Astor Foundation, not to any Astor heir. The male line his great-great-grandfather had built an empire to perpetuate simply stopped. What the name kept was a hotel, not a family. The Hotel Astor opened in Times Square in 1904, blazing with electric light over a fortune, still, at that moment, very much in Astor hands. By the 1950s, it had passed out of the family's ownership entirely, and in 1967 the wrecking crews came for it, the same year the courts elsewhere in this record were settling the fate of another dynasty's land a continent away. The Astors had not lost Manhattan the way a ranch is lost to drought or a fortune is lost to a bad heir. They had simply stopped being the ones who lived there, one lease, one voyage, one foundation at a time, until the only thing still standing under the family's own name was a marquee that had already gone dark. Somewhere else in the country, at almost the same hour, another empire was learning that a name on a building was no protection at all once the men holding the debt decided they wanted it back. Chapter 7. The creditors took the castle. By the autumn of 1937, the men who held William Randolph Hearst's debts had finished counting what he owed them, and the number ran to $126 million. He had spent 3 decades building the largest private communications empire in the country, chains of newspapers, dozens of magazines, radio stations, coast to coast, financed almost entirely on borrowed money, and none of it had ever stopped turning for long enough to pay itself off. The reason the debt had never found a ceiling was sitting on a hilltop above the Pacific in San Simeon, California, a castle he had been building since 1919 and had never once declared finished. The debt was not a single mistake. It was the accumulated weight of decades in which Hearst had never met a rival newspaper he did not want to buy, a struggling studio he did not want to bankroll, or a wing of medieval European stonework he did not want shipped, stone by numbered stone, to a hill in California. His art collection alone was reckoned near $50 million, warehouses of it, much of it never even unpacked. By 1937, the corporations holding all of it together, the papers and the art and the unfinished castle, could no longer service what they owed. Hearst did the one thing a man who had never answered to anyone in his life does last. He signed his own voting stock over to an outsider, an attorney named Clarence Kern with ties to Chase Bank, and let another man decide what the empire would keep. Kern wasted no time. Newspapers went first, then the radio stations, and construction at San Simeon stopped outright, mid-wing, the scaffolding left standing over stone that would not be set for another decade. He cut the salary of the man whose name still ran across every masthead he was liquidating. If you have stayed with this record through 5 failed dynasties already, you already know the machine that ends an empire rarely announces itself as an ending. Subscribe if you want to see the whole ledger through to its close, because there are 2 collapses still ahead of this one, and Hearst is neither the strangest nor the last. The men holding his debt were only getting started. Hearst never filed for bankruptcy, not in 1937 and not afterward, and within the decade, the wartime economy would return him a measure of the control the trustee had taken. But the empire he recovered was a fraction of the one Kern inherited, and for 4 years, the man whose name still ran across 100 papers did not get to decide what happened to a single one of them. The clearest evidence of how far control had slipped came in 1941, when a portion of that $50 million art collection went up for sale not at an auction house, but on the 5th floor of Gimbel's department store in Manhattan, arranged through the Hammer galleries and staged jointly with Saks. Whole paneled rooms, stripped from European castles and shipped across an ocean to decorate a hilltop that had never gotten around to housing them, went out the door beside tapestries reckoned at $7 million and 3 complete French cloisters, entire medieval structures that had crossed the Atlantic once for Hearst's ambition and were now leaving a midtown sales floor for whoever could carry them home. There is no record of what Hearst said the day those rooms left the loading dock, only the fact that he let it happen rather than lose the papers that still carried his name. The scale of what had been built and what was now being unwound held its own arithmetic. $126 million owed by 1937, $50 million in art, sold at a department store, $7 million in tapestries alone, 250,000 acres at San Simeon, land his father George Hearst had begun assembling at Rancho Piedra Blanca back in 1865, land William Randolph Hearst inherited whole in 1919. More than 1 million further acres, though accounts of the exact total vary, at the family's Babicora Ranch in Chihuahua, Mexico, sold outright to the Mexican government for $2,500,000 in 1952, the year after Hearst died. An empire measured in millions of dollars and more than 1 million acres, and none of it had been enough to outrun what he owed. The castle itself outlived him without ever answering to him again. In 1957 and 1958, what remained of the San Simeon grounds passed to the state of California, and the private hilltop fortress that decades of debt had nearly cost him became a public monument that strangers could walk through for the price of a ticket. Hearst had spent nearly 40 years keeping strangers off that hilltop. The state opened it to anyone who could pay admission. Not every collapse in this record came from a ledger. The next one came by hand, in a small black bag, carried to a cabinet secretary's hotel room by a son who did not yet know what the money inside it would cost his own family before the decade was through. Chapter 8. The Bribe in the Black Bag. The son carrying the bag was Edward Doheny, Jr., the family called him Ned, and inside the plain paper wrapping sat $100,000 in cash, on its way to a cabinet secretary who had, only months before, agreed to lease the government's own oil to Ned's father. That father was Edward L. Doheny, and the fortune the money was meant to protect had begun on a single strike in April of 1892, a well he sank in a Los Angeles backyard that opened the city's entire oil boom. Within 3 years, his Los Angeles City oil field alone produced more than half of every barrel drawn from California soil, and Doheny built that first strike into Pan American Petroleum and Transport, one of the largest oil companies on Earth by the 1920s, its wells and tankers reaching from California to Mexico to the fields of the Gulf Coast. An empire built on wells needs leases, and by 1921, Doheny wanted a lease the government controlled directly, the Naval Petroleum Reserve at Elk Hills, California, crude oil set aside under the ground for the Navy's own warships and no one else's use, guarded against exactly the kind of private hand that was now reaching for it. To get it, Doheny did not write a check. Late in 1921, Ned and his own private secretary, a man named Hugh Plunkett, withdrew the $100,000 from a brokerage account, wrapped the bills in ordinary paper, packed the paper into a small black bag, and carried the bag by hand across the country to the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington, where they delivered it to the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, in his hotel room, with no witnesses and no receipt. Not long after, Fall signed the Elk Hills lease over to Doheny's company without competitive bidding, a naval reserve handed to one man's corporation with no other bidder ever given the chance to compete for it. Ned did not yet know what the bag would cost his family. The arrangement did not stay secret for long. A Senate investigation pulled the black bag into daylight and gave the whole affair a name that would outlive every man involved in it: the Teapot Dome scandal. In October of 1927, the United States Supreme Court declared the Elk Hills lease fraudulent and void from the start, and the oil that had been quietly diverted from the Navy's reserve went back under government control. Doheny's company returned more than $24 million to the government it had once courted with a hotel room bag of cash, and two separate juries sat down on nearly identical evidence to decide who exactly had committed the crime. They reached opposite verdicts on nearly the same facts. In 1929, Albert Fall was convicted of accepting a bribe, the first cabinet member in American history ever convicted of a felony. Edward Doheny, tried on essentially the same evidence for paying the very bribe Fall was convicted of taking, was acquitted, his jury clearing him in under an hour. Doheny did not extend to Fall the mercy his own jury had shown him. He foreclosed on Fall's New Mexico ranch soon after and left the convicted man destitute. You are left with the same paradox the country was left with in 1929. Was Albert Fall guilty of a crime that Edward Doheny, on the same evidence, was found not to have committed? Or did one jury simply believe a poor rancher deserved to pay, and the other believe a rich oilman deserved the doubt his money could buy? Whatever mercy the elder Doheny withheld from Fall, he had already given in full to his own son. Edward Doheny had given Ned a wedding gift of land in Beverly Hills, a parcel of a little more than 12 acres, and the family moved into the mansion built on it called Greystone in September of 1928. It had cost $3,166,578.12 to build. $100,000 carried in a black bag to Washington. $24 million carried back to the government that bag had tried to buy. $3 million spent on the house built to celebrate the marriage of the son who had carried it. The money moved in only one direction, and none of it protected what came next. 5 months after the family moved in, on the 16th of February 1929, Ned Doheny, 35 years old, was found shot dead inside Greystone alongside Hugh Plunkett, the same secretary who had carried the black bag to Washington with him 7 years before. Investigators ruled it a murder-suicide and closed the case within days, though the forensic record has never fully settled who fired first, or why the two men who had once carried a fortune to a cabinet secretary together ended their lives in the same room of the house that fortune had built. The mansion had stood finished for less than half a year. The house built to mark a wedding became the house where the marriage's own witness died. Ned's widow stayed on at Greystone for a time and then sold most of the surrounding acreage. Developers carved what remained into what is known today as Trousdale Estates, streets and driveways laid over ground that had once been a single wedding gift. The city of Beverly Hills bought the mansion itself in 1965 and opened it as a public park, and anyone can now walk the same terraced lawns where a wedding gift became a crime scene inside of a single year. Not every empire in this record fell to a courtroom or a family tragedy, but the one still ahead lost its land to neither. It fell to a corporation with money enough to buy an empire outright, and the fight over that purchase would end up writing its own chapter of American law. Chapter 9. The Dynasty the Market Swallowed. In May of 1967, an oil company out of Los Angeles named Occidental Petroleum opened a hostile bid for a company that still carried, in its land and its name, the memory of one man's private empire, the Kern County Land Company. No family stood in the way this time, no widow signing away a forest, no son carrying a bribe in a black bag. What stood between Occidental and the company was a board of directors defending its shareholders, and the fight would end not with a scandal or a funeral, but with a ruling of the United States Supreme Court. The man whose name the company still carried was James Ben Ali Haggin, and his name had already surfaced once before in this account, on the losing side of a courtroom rather than a boardroom. He was the same Haggin whose upstream water claims on the Kern River were defeated by Henry Miller's cattle empire in 1886, a defeat that pushed him into a private water-sharing deal 2 years later. That courtroom loss never touched the land itself. Working with his agent, William Carr, Haggin assembled roughly 300,000 acres of the San Joaquin Valley by working every advantage the Desert Land Act allowed, then cut irrigation canals across ground that had been semi-arid scrub and turned it into some of the most productive farmland in California. Land was never Haggin's only fortune. He was a principal investor in the Anaconda copper mines of Montana. A mountain in the Anaconda Range still carries his name, and he held a stake in the Comstock silver lode that had already made half a dozen other Western fortunes before his. Away from the mines and the irrigation ditches, Haggin bred champion thoroughbreds, and in 1886, the same year his water claim went down in the California courts, his horse Ben Ali won the Kentucky Derby. The name was not a stable affectation. It traced back to Haggin's own maternal grandfather, Ibrahim Ben Ali, a physician who had once served as a captain in the Sultan's Janissary Guard, a lineage that reached a Kentucky racetrack 100 years and an ocean away from where it began. The land and irrigation empire Haggin assembled became the Kern County Land Company, an agricultural concern that ran for decades as a working business, not a headline, until Occidental's tender offer landed in 1967. The Kern County Board did not fight Occidental with lawyers alone. It found a larger buyer willing to absorb the company on friendlier terms, the Houston conglomerate Tenneco, and the merger closed on the 30th of August, 1967, at a price of roughly $430 million. Occidental lost the company it had tried to seize, but it had quietly secured an option on the merged stock before the deal closed, and when that option paid out, Occidental walked away with a profit of $19,506,419.22, a fortune pulled out of a fight it had lost. That profit became a Supreme Court case in its own right. Federal securities law required corporate insiders to surrender any short swing profit made on company stock within 6 months, a rule built to stop exactly the kind of trading Occidental appeared to have done. Occidental argued the profit did not count because the exchange had been forced on it by the merger, not chosen. In 1973, the Supreme Court agreed unanimously and let Occidental keep the money. A takeover fight that began with one company trying to swallow another ended by rewriting how the law treats a shareholder who loses the war but still profits from the peace. Of the 8 fortunes chronicled here, Haggin's is the only one that fell to neither scandal nor bankruptcy, nor a family that could not hold itself together. It fell because a company with enough capital to buy it simply did, and the court that settled the argument over the spoils never once had to ask who had cheated whom. What survives of the 8 empires is no longer the fortunes themselves. It is the ground each one stood on, and the ground is where this record turns next. Chapter 10. What the Land Keeps. South from Asheville, the Blue Ridge Parkway runs today through forest unbroken for miles on either side of the road, and that forest was once a dying man's dowry, sold within a month of his funeral because his widow could no longer carry it. That roughly 86,000 acres passed to the federal government in 1914 for $5 an acre, sold by his widow, who called it an effort to perpetuate my husband's pioneer work in forest conservation. The trees do not know whose dowry they were. They are Pisgah National Forest now, walked by hikers who have never heard the family's name, and the house at the center of it still stands, open to ticket holders, its upkeep now paid in admission fees rather than timber leases. Not every empire left a monument that visitors can walk into. Of Miller and Lux, dissolved in 1964, what survives is not the ranch land, but the law. Lux versus Haggin still governs how California divides its water between the ground and the river, cited in courtrooms that have never heard of the dirty plate route, arguing questions no one at the ranch's founding could have imagined a court would still be asking a century and a half later. Of the Maxwell Grant, the deed itself passed through hands its patent never imagined, sold and resold by owners with no memory of the household Lucien Maxwell once fed 30 guests a night from tables set with solid silver. But the evidentiary standard the Supreme Court set to defend it, that a government patent cannot be voided except on proof clear, unequivocal, and convincing, still shields land titles that have nothing to do with Cimarron. The Astor name outlasted Astor ownership by exactly the arithmetic the ground leases were built to produce. The buildings still stand on Manhattan blocks the family once owned outright, and not one carries an Astor's signature on the deed. The hotel that bore the family name longer than any building survived it by decades, and then came down in 1967, the same year the Kern County Dynasty across the country went to a conglomerate. The other 4 sites can still be visited. The XIT left no single building behind it, only 94 pasture lines erased from the land, and a state historical marker noting that 3 million acres once carried a single brand, sold off in parcels between 1901 and a last transaction in 1963. The Kern County Ranch Haggin, irrigated out of desert scrub, is farmed still, but the deed sits inside Tenneco's 1967 acquisition, a name on a balance sheet rather than a name on a gate. Greystone, the mansion built for Doheny's son, and the lawn where that son died 5 months after moving in, belongs to the city of Beverly Hills now, a public park where nothing marks the exact spot, and where wedding parties now pose for photographs on the same terrace. And at San Simeon, the castle Hearst, never finished, belongs to the state of California, a historical monument since 1957. In 2005, a $95 million conservation agreement protected roughly 82,000 acres and 18 miles of coastline around it. On land, the family still partly holds today, more than 80,000 acres of what was once nearly 250,000, the largest stretch of any of the 8 empires still standing in something like its original hands. Line the surviving numbers up, and the scale still astonishes even in retreat. 86,000 acres at Pisgah, 82,000 more locked under the San Simeon easement, 12.5 acres at Greystone, 94 vanished pastures at the XYT, $430 million that changed hands at Kern County and left not 1 acre in a Haggin's name. None of it adds back to what any of these 8 families once held. A forest, a monument, a park, a marker, a balance sheet entry, 5 different afterlives for 8 different collapses, and not one of them is the empire itself. What survives all 8 collapses is not the land itself. It is the shape of the losing, and that shape is the one thing all 8 families share, however differently each one went down. Chapter 11. 8 Ways to Lose Everything. That shape has a name now, and by the end of this ledger it will have 8 of them, one for every empire this film has followed from its first acre to its last owner. The Vanderbilts lost Biltmore to dissipation, the plain arithmetic of one fortune divided across too many heirs, and a house too costly for any of them alone to keep, the new income and estate taxes the record blames alongside it, and a widow who chose a forest sale over a slow bleed. The Millers lost well over 1,000,000 acres to failed succession, a builder's fortune handed to a son-in-law. The record itself calls incompetent, a standing charity abolished the year it might have mattered most, and a company wound down not by any single disaster, but by 2 decades of decisions a stronger heir would not have made. The XYT was never lost in the ordinary sense. It was spent, sold, parcel by parcel, exactly as its British owners had always intended, a ranch that ran cattle only to hold the ground until the ground itself could be liquidated, and the sell-off took 62 years and ended on schedule. The Maxwell Grant went fastest of the 8, its price carried off in a handbag and burned through a failed bank and a failed railroad within 5 years, a kingdom's worth of cash gone before the kingdom's last tenant had finished mourning its owner. The Astors chose their collapse, a senior branch that looked at the city its ground leases had built and sailed for England rather than govern it, and a last New York heir who could have kept the name alive and instead gave the fortune to a foundation and let the line end with him on purpose. The Hearsts built past what any income could carry and let the creditors do what no rival newspaper chain ever managed, take the empire's own voting stock out of its founder's hands while he was still alive to watch it happen. The Dohenys lost theirs to a bribe carried in a small black bag, an acquittal that could not undo what the trial had already cost the family's name, and a death in a 5-month-old mansion the record still cannot close. And the last of the 8 went not to any family failure at all, but to a Houston conglomerate with a checkbook large enough to end a dynasty in a single boardroom vote. Every one of these 8 families once controlled land on a scale no private citizen holds anywhere in America today. Every one of them lost it. A widow's grief, an incompetent heir, a ranch built from the start to be sold, a fortune burned through in a handbag, a flight to England, a trustee's signature, a bribe in a small black bag, a boardroom vote, 8 instruments that looked nothing alike, and the outcome landed the same way 8 separate times. 8 different machines, but look closely enough and every one of them took hold at the same joint. Not one of these empires failed because the men who built them were foolish, and not one of them was destroyed from outside by a rival strong enough to have beaten them in their prime. Each one broke at the exact point where the scale a single determined man had assembled outran what any one family, any one heir, any one generation could actually govern. His power was just as if he owned the whole outfit, an employee once said of Maxwell, and the line could stand carved over all 8 gates. It held only for as long as one man was alive to hold it together, and no longer. That is not a story about 8 unlucky families so much as it is the shape scale takes in American hands, in anyone's hands, once it grows past the size a single person can actually watch. The railroad crews who never held title to a foot of the XIT, the tenement families who paid an Astor sub-landlord for a roof no Astor ever inspected, the ranch hands who ate off Miller's own discarded plates so the herds would stay unburned, none of them appear on a single deed in this film, and every one of them outlasted the empire that briefly employed them. The land remembers the machines. It does not remember who was standing on it when each one finally broke. If a fence line, a courthouse wing, or a hospital ward near where you grew up still carries a family name, nobody quite explains anymore. The odds are it is running one of these 8 machines to this day, whichever one it happens to be, and the people who can still say what stood there before are getting fewer every year. Getting that record down while someone still can is the whole reason this channel exists, and the next ledger like this one is already being assembled. Subscribe, and be there when it does. 8 empires, 8 machines, one country still deciding acre by acre which kind of ending it wants next.